C, which provides a line-by-line RAG rating, and that's on pages 63 to 66 of your papers. Because we hadn't completed and concluded on all the areas of sampling, we didn't get to the point of identifying audit adjustments, so the report is light in that instance. Appendix D does highlight adjustments that management identified after the first set of accounts and the set they gave us to audit, and those are set out on pages 69 and 70 of the report. Appendix D does highlight those disclosure changes that we identified through our work, and those are set out on pages 67 to 68. Based on the work we were able to do, with that purpose to try and unearth issues, we've made 12 recommendations for management to action to improve the controls and the arrangements of the financial reporting. And those are set out on pages 57 to 62. And I'm pleased to say all of those recommendations have been agreed by officers. The rest of the report sets out some of those informations that we're required to report to you. So, for example, the audit fees. The end of this is that we will issue a disclaimer of opinion in 23-24. And just to be pedantic, it's probably inappropriate, given that we are saying we will issue a disclaimer of opinion, to describe these accounts before you as audited, because by their very nature, they're not. That's all I intended to say. I'm happy to pick up any questions that members may have.
Thank you. I think, speak on behalf of all of us, in that we've been waiting for this kind of discussion for 4 years. Yeah. And I would like to express our thanks to you for achieving in a short space of time what others could not over a prolonged time. So thank you very much. Members, questions? Councillor Cope.
Thank you, Chair, and I just want to echo what the Chairman's just said there. I mean, what you've put in front of us in comparison to what we've had from BDO in the past, quite frankly, it's chalk and cheese. This is a really impressive piece of work and really goes into detail on the things we need to consider. I guess the thing that jumped out at me most from the report is the part around the minimum revenue provision, because when I'm looking at council accounts, that's sort of the linchpin that everything else is built off. And obviously, you've said that currently we're benchmarking at 1% against CFR. You feel it should be 2%. It looks like the management response is we're comfortable. What should I be thinking about when I'm looking at this as to whether what I'm being told is correct? What should I be looking for there?
Thank you. In terms of the minimum revenue provision and the workings that we've been given, there were schedules and there were workings to support some of the elements in the schedules. The minimum revenue provision is around setting aside money to pay off those assets purchased through debt in the future. In most cases, there are instances where the minimum revenue provision the council would have sought out advice, and that advice, how they take that advice and apply the advice given from the external advisor. So, for instance, the useful economic life of the assets. So the council uses a 50-year timeline for most of the assets that is purchased through borrowing. Now, the question management should ask themselves, and support is, do those assets, will they exist over that time period in which they've taken the loans to pay off the minimum revenue provision? Now, the risk with the minimum revenue provision, it's potentially, can be potentially understated, which means further down the line, the council may have to pay slightly more, which will impact its general fund.
If I may just add to that. So to your specific question, what should you be looking at? So we think that 2% is a guide. And as Keith mentioned, when we looked at how the council had set its MRP, there were a number of questions that we could pose that we weren't able, in the time available, to get to a conclusion against. So the standard use of a high level of useful economic life is one. What we'd expect is a much more nuanced determination of what the useful economic life should be for each asset. SIPFA in its guidance says that if you just default into the maximum useful economic life, then perhaps it's not being thought through sufficiently. So that was one aspect. The other aspect was that we felt the MRP policy approved by council was light in detail compared to what we see elsewhere. So we've effectively just laid a marker in the sand, and it will be something that we will look at again in more detail for 24-25.
You follow up? Yeah.
Thanks. So just for my benefit, because I'm not a financial person, can you explain to me what the link is between the expended length of value of the asset and this 1-2% CFR charge that you're recommending that we look at? How do those two things interact? Can you just explain that to me in layman's terms?
So the 2% benchmark some of it will depend on where you are on your journey of making MRP provision. Now, we obviously don't have a lot of information we've been able to look at to substantiate whether it's appropriate, the current percentage you have and where you are on that journey. In terms of what you need to be looking at, it's effectively the money set aside potentially to repay debt. It may not be immediately, but in the future. So that charge is a charge to the general fund. So over time, the council will set aside some money to pay for potential borrowing in the future. That is taken now. The benefit will come later on down the years.
If I may. So I'm not sure I'm going to be able to explain that link at all. But I think if we go back to what as a council you've got to try and do, you've got to charge a prudent provision to allow you to put resources aside for the repayment of debt. The 2% benchmark is typically what we see local authorities achieving, and I think that's the linkage with I think the linkage with the capital finance requirement is previously in the past the percentage of minimum revenue provision was stated in statute, so it was stated at 4%. I think guidance, statutory guidance has moved away from that. It now gives more of a choice for local authorities. It gives various methods in which local authorities can determine is the most appropriate to make this prudent provision. As I said, we didn't get completely to the bottom of this, so we have just posed questions. So officers respond that they think the provision that's being made is prudent, could be right. At this point, we're holding our judgment on it.
Councillor McIntyre.
Thank you. Hi, I've got a whole list of questions, but I'll start with the first one. You said a couple of times in that that some of the balances you are unable to conclude on, and obviously there's quite a few, there's about 4 pages of disclaimed balances where you've said you're unable to conclude on them. And you said that that's because there's not been enough detail. And we'll look at it on the next set of financial statements. I'm not quite sure about timings now, and I'm confusing myself as to what's happening next, but is there any benefit of doing a mid-year audit between the two sets of financial statements so that we can almost close out some of the potential problems and the issues that you've raised in the 23-24 audit, so we've got time to make sure we've got the right records and answers to the questions so that we've got some more certainty over the 24-25?
Thank you. So our intention is to plan the 24-25 audit starting in February, March, so now-ish weeks. We also hope to undertake some interim testing of selected areas. But again, it's weeks in which things would need to be changed and improved. I don't know how likely that is, given the minimum amount of time that's available. Ideally, you would hope everything would be addressed, but I suspect not. So I suspect much that we're reporting to you tonight for 23-24, there will be a lot, I suspect, common points that will report to you for 24-25.
I guess, though, there must be some, and I don't know whether, Mrs. Radford and I haven't had a chance to talk about this, but whether or not there will be some balances which are more important than others. So closing balances on the property portfolio valuations, which you were unable to conclude on, then I'm assuming we've got a clear idea as to which ones are actually far more important to us as a council and the impact on the financial statements that we are trying our best to conclude, so we've got something more certain than have another year of saying there are insufficient records and therefore we're going to push it further down the road.
Yes, but just to say, we're making one judgment on the financial statements. So we've done the line-by-line analysis just recognising it's going to be rebuilding over several years. But there is just one judgment given in the opinion. So we're not saying certain balances will be disclaimed, certain balances are okay.
It'd just be nice to have fewer than 4 pages next time.
Councillor Wilson.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the report, and thank you whoever did the accounts for 23-24, because they've been online, well, the draft version since the 1st of October, but this is the first time we've actually had a committee to be able to go through them, and I'm very much not a financial professional either, not at all. I am a director of a company, so I have seen a balance sheet before, and I take the point that some presentational points are going to be cleared up, but I thought I'd mention them, a few of them, just in case they haven't been noticed. I said I've seen a balance sheet before. I think you can see one on page 14, but it's labelled as a cash flow statement. And the cash flow statement's on the next page, contrary to the contents. But there's one, I just wanted to look at one or two big changes that I noticed when the accounts first came out. There's page 7. When we set the budget this time last year, we had this as the MTFS, and it said that the opening balance for the closing balance of the reserves for 23-24 was £49.5 million in total. That's on page 7. And that's now, 2 months later, it was actually 30.6 million. So a difference of 19 million. Can you explain why that happened? How that happened?
I suspect that's a question more for officers than me.
There's a few other items where there's a big change from year to year. In your work, do you look at that and like depreciation, property and economic development, just massive changes, 20 or 25, 27 million in different tables from year to year? Is that normal?
Well, it's certainly not normal, no.
Is it something that, as a lay person, a member of the audit committee, I should be worried about?
I think that it's appropriate that the audit committee would expect there to be consistency between the accounts and the flow through. So yes.
Thank you. Just a general comment, as an auditor in another field, sometimes quite literally, you go and do your first audit and you draw a line in the sand and you move on from there. One of the first things you do in my field of auditing is you have a discussion with management about what you've found. Can I ask whether that discussion has taken place and whether you're happy with the way it went?
So yes, we've had regular discussions with Vicky and other members of the finance team. We discussed as a draft the audit findings report, and officers commented where they felt there were inaccuracies, and we amended as appropriate, and officers have signed up to the recommendations. So I think there's been that ongoing engagement. I think as we try to set out in the report, I think it's been challenging. I think at times we've struggled to progress things and to understand the trail that supports the financial statement. I think at times the finance team has struggled given the quantity of audit queries, which was probably to be expected in this first year after so many years of not being audited. I'm sure Vicky will have a view as to how it's felt from the officer's side.
Yes, it has been very, very challenging. Well, as you've rightly said, we had accounts a number of years. New finance team came in after 23-24, so they didn't have the history, so it was more difficult for them to find some of those trails for that very reason. And as Darren just said, the sheer quantity of samples was demanding and very, very tricky. And I know Darren said there was a lot that was outstanding. We did provide a lot of information, a lot of files, and I'm talking in the hundreds. And then there's duplicate queries, so there's stuff come back, so we provide more and things like that. So to kind of put that context, it wasn't just that, there was lots and lots outstanding. We did do a lot of work with the team, and we did collaborate through the whole audit. We certainly had once or twice a week we had meetings, and we were constantly in dialogue and discussing the areas of concern. and it was challenging, and it was also challenging on officers, the fact they haven't had an audit for a long period of time, so it's almost understanding what an audit is from an officer perspective as well. So, and that's not just in finance, that was, in other offices as well. Councillor Wilson, if you've got some specific queries, then we can come back to you on those, because, sometimes you can't see the wood for the trees when you've pulled these things together. So, absolutely, if you've got any concerns, then we can address those separately.
Yeah, sure, I totally understand that. I don't think there's too much sort of missing or anything. It's just some of it's a bit mangled, that's all.
Councillor Cope.
Thank you. I'm just getting into this action plan, because I think it's really important this committee is able to review this and try and make sure that it is implemented, or if it is not implemented, why. When you talk about journals and quality of audit evidence, you say the risk of management override controls often involve the manipulation of financial reporting process by recording inappropriate or unauthorised journal entries. Is that basically just because there's someone at the top who is having to manually input this, or is this what are we getting at there? Is it just human error, or is it sort of trying to get things to fit other things and compounding errors?
Is this specifically on the action plan? So
Yeah, specifically on action plan, the one that says journals and quality of audit evidence. The second sentence talks about a risk of obviously manipulation of financial reporting, which to me sounds quite scary again as a layperson. So I just want to understand exactly what we mean by that.
So to reassure you, every audit, both commercial, public sector, starts with the premise that management will seek to override controls for their own financial gain. So it builds a sense of scepticism by the auditor. So I wouldn't necessarily be alarmed by the fact that we talk about that.
Okay.
What we're just trying to record here is that we assess the control environment of how officers post and control journals, because that's an input into the general ledger, and it's the general ledger that's the source to produce the financial statements. So if officers that had access to the general ledger were seeking to operate inappropriately, it's likely to be through the posting of journals. So we assess the environment to say, is there a weakness in that environment that would facilitate that? So that's one element that we're commenting on there. And then the other aspect about the quality of audit evidence is just trying to bring a theme together. Very early on in the audit, the discussion and some of the information we were given back in response to some of our samples, it wasn't prime evidence. So there was a discussion about the type and the quality of evidence that should be provided to respond to either the request to support a transaction or the evidence provided to respond to an audit query. So it was part of that education.
So just so I can sort of get into my mind how the process works. So effectively, transaction occurs, then a member of the management or a member of the finance team inputs the journal into the ledger, and they should have a supporting evidence for why they inputted in that way. Is that correct?
That's very much the case. So if we selected journals on a risk basis that met certain criteria that we determined, and then we sought to understand the business rationale for making that journal, and that's then the evidence that we sought. The control point that we make here around the risk of management override is that your control environment here allows someone to post a journal and authorise a journal. Ideally, you would want a separation of duties. So if someone posted it, there'd be someone else that would authorise it. Typically, within small finance teams, that's not always possible, and it can be an accepted risk that officers have the ability to both post and authorise journals. Where that is accepted, then some authorities introduce another control whereby they would periodically review journals where there was to see if that weakness is being abused.
Would you say that we are large, medium, or small? You said small teams.
I'm small.
Thank you. Councillor Wilson.
Yeah, it does actually say on page 18 of the full agenda pack, the second paragraph, the council's finance team is small, and then it says, and there has been 8 to 10 week staff changes over the last year. Is that a misprint?
That's a typo.
What was it meant to be?
I think it was just making the point that we know that there's been changes in the finance team over the year.
Right. If I could just ask a question about the next page, page 19, the very final paragraph sentence. It says, we've been unable to conclude that the other information to be published with the financial statements, including the annual governance statement, is consistent with our knowledge of your organisation and with the financial statements that have been audited. Is this, you talked about a sense of scepticism, is this because you just don't have an opinion about it, or it's because you think the other statements like the AGS are incorrect?
No, it's very much the former. It's within that context of a disclaimer of opinion, so you don't give any positive element for the other information or the annual governance statement. Everything gets wrapped up in that we're not making or issuing an opinion.
Vicky, you wanted to?
Yeah, I just wanted to come back on the journal point and what Darren said. We do have the control in place that has been gone through the internal audit process, where we have that kind of sampling. So we get monthly. I get a monthly report myself, which I review, and it's question if there's anything exceptionally large or exceptionally odd. So that's our mitigation for being in a small team.
Thank you. Anyone else? Richard.
This might come under this, not having an opinion, but on page 24, the left-hand column, risks identified in our audit plan, the end of that, it says, we therefore identified this as a financial statement level risk, and there is a risk that the accounts could be materially misstated, i.e. potential omissions from the accounts of transactions, lack of appropriate audit trails, and risk of potential management override. So you mentioned that earlier, but the accounts could be materially misstated. So does that come under the kind of category of just you can't take any assurance at all from the accounts?
So this is in respect of the accounts model that we said the authority has used, and the two tables on that page set out the areas that weren't within the general ledger. There wasn't that flow from prior years, so there wasn't the opening balances from 22-23 rolled forward in the general ledger. There wasn't all of the transactions in 23-24 in the general ledger. This account model, because of the pressure of time, was a shortcut. That's what we're just trying to describe here. And we identified it as a significant risk to understand because it's so unusual to have this account model and this shortcut. We're not making a conclusion on the accounts. We're not saying they are materially misstated. We don't know. We truly don't know. From our discussions with officers, the arrangement of using this account model in 23-24 won't be repeated in 24-25. The intention is everything will be on the general ledger, the accounts will be produced from the general ledger, a more normal, typical situation.
And this is because they had to do basically 4 years of accounts, and it's led to this unusual situation. Is it unusual for a council to have this sort of essay crisis of accounts and have to do them all in 1 year?
It's not unusual. Well, it's not usual. I mean, I think that's the situation the sector's in, where so many authorities had a backlog of audits and authorities had a backlog of not producing financial statements. I have a personal view, and I'll share it with you. I think even if an authority wasn't having an audit, I think it still had the ability to produce the statement of accounts and should have done so.
Sorry, that applies here? That applies to this authority?
Yes.
Vicky?
Yeah, just Darren mentioned some of the points I was going to raise, that to expedite the accounts, we use this model. So it's effectively, many of you probably won't have heard of it, but the SIP for Big Red Button that they introduced many years ago. So it was basically a consolidation tool that produces your accounts. So the reason why there's these tables in here with difference in figures was because we had to produce 4 years worth of accounts really quickly. We hadn't had a chance to roll the ledger over. So we were producing accounts where the ledger was still in 2021, I believe. So we used the model as an independent tool, did all our journals and things like that in there, because we needed to do quite a bit of work in the general ledger to be able to do it. So quite rightly, moving forward, we are now rolled over into the correct year. Anything that is in the model will be, or anything that's in the ledger will then be replicated in the model to produce the accounts. So we're not going to have these discrepancies in future. It was just, unfortunately, because we had to get things done really quickly, it was the simplest way of doing it. So hopefully that's reassuring.
Rob? Councillor Lee?
You're very welcome to call me Rob. I think, first of all, I'd like to echo everyone's comments. It's an absolute breath of fresh air to see an informative, a helpful and detailed report on the council's finances in terms of looking in from an audit perspective. I say audit perspective because obviously they're not technically audited. Fully agree with you and completely understand that. It's a big leap forward. I think for me as a councillor, when I was elected in 2023, I'd never been so scared coming into public office with no understanding of what was going on in the finances and no ability to find out. And I think Vicky touching on the fact that ledgers hadn't been even rolled over since 2021. So that's more than 2 years prior to my election, was a real scary place to be, because the public have elected you to do stuff and make decisions, and you have no financial information that you can sort of hand on heart say I trust. It's a really scary place to be. So the fact that we're starting to rebuild some of that trust with this audit work is a great step forward. I've got a couple of questions. The one I was more interested on, there's two different sets of page numbers, I think, so forgive me on that one. I think on... So I think on the Grant Thornton report, I think it's page 50, disclaimed balance statement. So it's the section entitled Depreciation, Amortisation and Impairment. And it says, we have no assurance on the opening balances for property, plant and equipment. I didn't think I'd have to talk about PPE again post-pandemic, but here we are. And investment properties, including the revaluations. Therefore, we have no assurance over the depreciation, amortisation and impairment recognised in the CIES. Could you just give us a little bit more background on that? One, perhaps a little bit of a layman's description, if that's okay. Thinking time is fine. And also whether that RAG from red has an opportunity to move to amber and to green in a realistic time frame. The answer, it's better to come back to me separately is also fine. I understand it. We're now in the world of dealing with competent experts that we're building confidence in, which is a great space to be.
Thank you. So having not had an audit in the prior years, and the depreciation, amortization, and impairments would have required those balances, particularly the opening balances, to basically charge the depreciation to the asset, to the council's general fund. Depreciation itself is a charge that the council incurs on its assets for using them. So, for instance, if you buy a car over 10 years, you charge that equally over that period of time. Now, the issue we've had with the opening balances and no assurance means we're unable to rely on those balances which have been rolled forward for a number of years and are unaudited. There are also issues where we had the issues with the fixed assets register. Now, in terms of building that assurance, potentially over time, if the council potentially has its reevaluation in the year, for next year potentially, we can review that and come up with an opinion. And also, if we look at the council's existence of those assets and we're sure that they actually exist, we can come to an opinion over the depreciation charge for potentially future periods.
So, if they'd been rolled over each year, would you have had more confidence?
Sorry?
If those balances had been rolled over each year, would you have had more confidence?
If they'd been audited. However, they're not audited, and they're disclaimed. So, no. Our focus was on the closing balance. However, there were limitations around that.
Thank you.
Councillor Wilson.
Thank you, Chair. I think it's my last point on this item. It's on page 66, and I know we've already talked disclaimed balances on the balance sheet. It does say, though, that there is no risk of material misstatement 23-24 for short-term borrowing, long-term liabilities. So as a layperson, I would have thought it would be possible to know how much cash the council had at a certain point in time, at 23-24. But it does say there's a risk of material misstatement of cash and cash equivalent. Can you explain how it's possible that there's a risk that we don't know how much cash the council had?
Sorry, what page in the Grant Thornton report?
Page 66 of the full agenda pack, which is page 52 of the report. Thanks.
So when we reviewed the council's cash, we would have looked at your bank reconciliation, so we would have got confirmations from counterparties, and that would have been reconciled back to the general ledger to understand what the cash position is at year end. Now, the issue we encountered was linked to the model. There were a series of balances that came through into the bank rec, which were from prior year, and those prior year balances were not disclaimed, were disclaimed. Therefore, we couldn't give an opinion on the closing cash balance that management had prepared.
So it goes back to the same problem you already explained to me. Thank you.
Councillor McIntyre, then Councillor Lee.
Just in terms of looking forward, because I see a number of recommendations and actions in the report, how are we monitoring progress against those?
Vicky, I think.
Yeah, we are, I think the terms of remit of this committee is to have recommendations annually. So we will report regularly. I'm not sure if Alex, as part of internal audit, will monitor any of these, but certainly we will be as part of the process for closing the accounts, and I would imagine as part of the that process we'll be doing the reporting to this committee as well.
Councillor Lee?
Thank you, Chair. It's a minor presentational thing. All of the PDFs I've been able to find, you can't text search in them. So when I read something and I go back, so I've really struggled trying to answer or find the questions that I was going to ask, because I know the things I want to ask about. Obviously, I think I'd try Chair's patience if I was to ask for some time to read back through this and ask my other questions. So perhaps if we could have this one republished in a searchable format, that would be really cool.
Alex, do you want to make any comment about internal audit in relation to this process, or is that something you might like to think about?
Thank you, Chair. Do you mean in respect of tracking the action points that are coming out of this?
Yes.
I'm quite happy to liaise with finance colleagues and work out probably the best approach to check on progress in terms of, I'm not sure whether we've got any specific timetable for the action points or whether they're just general action points that need to be actioned in the next 2 months. Do we know?
I was just going to say we will automatically follow up on all of these recommendations as part of 24-25 work.
Yes, but we want to make sure that they happen. So, yeah, perhaps that's something you could liaise and work out a plan. Yeah. Thank you. Councillor McIntyre.
Thank you. I'm happy for this to be my last one. One of the points or the key recommendations in the audit report is about, am I moving on to the next bit ahead of time? Am I allowed to ask about? I'm confusing myself. Anyway, I'm going to ask now anyway. In the key recommendations, you talk about portfolio holder for finance performance shouldn't be, or best practice is it wouldn't sit on this committee. So my role is the next table topic. I'll stop myself. I was excited about that. Can I be first on the next one?
But I think we deal with it later on. Yeah. I'll certainly say something. Members, any other questions for Keith? And I can't read. Thank you. Rob.
Can we formalise your kind comments about the auditors to a formal note of thanks to them? Because I think it is an absolute breath of fresh air, and I think when we get good stuff, I think it should be recognised. We're quick to hold people to account, and rightly so. But in a number of meetings, when people have really hit the bar, we've made notes of thanks to them. I think that's an ideal opportunity.
That's a very good idea, and I will certainly do that. Yes. Councillor Wilson.
Thank you. You're probably just about to come on to this, but we just received, just before the meeting, an alternative recommendation for this agenda item. It's really the same, but it tidies it up. It says the committee is advised to, 1, approve 4 points, and then 2, note 2 points. And before it was just note all the points, but some of the points were approved. I take it you're aware of that and you're about to come on to it?
Do I nod?
Yes, to confirm, Councillor Wilson, that's now the sort of revised recommendation that the committee will be voting on shortly.
Voting? We never vote.
If everyone's unanimous.
Okay, so are we all done with questions? Good. How do we formulate this? Are we recommending or noting? Or?
I think, Chair, all the councillors have seen the revised recommendation. Presuming that they've all written it, I think if you just get confirmation from them that they're happy to agree the resolution as per.
As per the new revised recommendation. Is everybody happy with the newly revised recommendation? Please indicate by raising your hands. Thank you. I think that's unanimous. And that was the first vote we've had since I've been chair of this group. Gosh, what a groundbreaker. Moving on, next item on the agenda may well be related. It's annual audit report.
I will hand directly over to Grant Thornton on this one. I've got nothing else to add.
Handing on as well, I believe.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, my colleague Andy Nichols, who's online, will introduce the report.
Thanks, Aaron. As I'm the first person to speak from Teams, can I just check the chamber can hear me? Great. Okay, so this is the second part of the statutory responsibility of the auditor, the auditor's annual report. The auditor's annual report is technically a summary of all the work we've undertaken during the year, but the main component of it, I'm sure the one that we'll be most interested in, is the value for money commentary. So just to recap what that is, this council, like all councils, is responsible for putting in place proper arrangements to use its resources economically, efficiently and effectively, and under the relevant legislation, and in this case the 2020 code, which has recently been refreshed, it's our responsibility to satisfy ourselves that you have put those proper arrangements in place and produce a commentary under 3 key headings relating to financial sustainability, governance, which includes timeliness of decision making, risk management and other arrangements around behaviour and standards, and improving economy, efficiency and effectiveness, which covers a broad range of factors around performance management, procurement activity and working in partnership. Where we are not fully satisfied that there are proper arrangements in place, we make recommendations. And the most serious of those recommendations are called statutory recommendations, which is where there's a significant weakness in arrangements and it's required to be discussed by full council. There are no such recommendations in this report. Moving down from that, at one level of recommendation, which we've designated key recommendations, is where we still think there are issues with the arrangements which are significant. And there are 3 of those recommendations in the report, and I'll touch on those briefly after this. We also make what we call improvement recommendations. We're at liberty to do so. We're not required to do so, but we're committed to adding value through this process. And therefore, we've raised a dozen or so improvement recommendations, which are aimed at managing future risk and supporting continuous improvement. So I'll highlight the key recommendations as it's already clear that members are keen to raise questions about those. So on page 32 of the Auditor's Annual Report, there's a page 110 in the agenda pack, is that starts a summary of the recommendations. So the first key recommendation relates to the Council's financial position. It's well known that the challenge facing the council over the short and medium term is significant, and the negative trajectory of the use of resources is acute. And as at 23-24, the council was still developing its transformation programme to respond to those challenges. So clearly the council needs to finalise and implement that transformation programme at pace to help set the finances on a sustainable footing. That recommendation, probably not a surprise, but obviously very, very important. Related to that, the second key recommendation focuses on the issues with the 23-24 budget, which have been discussed previously and which related to the translation of costs of finance being translated into the budget incompletely. And so the recommendation clearly is that the quality assurance processes around the budget need to be sufficient to ensure that there is a clear and accurate picture of the financial pressures that the council faces. Thirdly, and I believe this touched on the question that Councillor McIntyre was about to ask, relating to this committee, it's important to remember that the review is one of arrangements, not of individuals. It's about the council as a whole, as a corporate entity, officers and members together. That being said, we were not fully satisfied that the arrangements around this committee aligned to best practice as set out by SIPFA and others, and therefore we've made a recommendation to review the committee's constitution and function against that guidance, so the council can satisfy itself that it is aligned to that best practice. Those are the three key recommendations. As I say, there is a number of improvement recommendations. Rather than going through each, I'll just highlight a theme, I think, which is clarity. Council needs clarity about its financial position, clarity about the scenarios that would flow from key assumptions and variations in those assumptions, clarity about clarity on the monitoring and how the risk management processes are supporting the scrutiny of that as it goes through. Very happy, along with Darren, to take any questions on the content of the report and how we put it together.
Okay, thank you very much. Leanne, Councillor McIntyre.
Thank you. Thank you for the report. It's really interesting actually to read it, and lots of good commentary in there. So thank you for all the work that's gone into that. As you've already heard, half of my preamble. As you just pointed out, obviously, there was a discussion as to whether or not which roles should sit on this committee and which shouldn't, and which guidance we should look at and what's proportionate. And thank you very much for the conversation that we've had prior to this committee to discuss it. I think the conversation I would like to have in this committee is whether or not how we as a committee feel like that about it, including sort of officer input, but also I think the premise is that the topics are executive functions, whereas everything that comes here comes directly here. So for instance, this report and the other audit reports, nothing comes through executive first, and we don't sign it off. So the rationale that I understood as to why we wouldn't want certain roles to be on here is because we almost get to interrogate it twice, and almost and we don't have the sort of the split of responsibilities or the split of critique, if you like. So I guess I'd quite value a conversation through the committee members, but also monitoring officer, chief exec, anyone else that wants to feed into whether or not we believe that the portfolio holder role for finance and performance and any other executive role should or should not sit on this committee.
Thank you. As I think that I'm the only person, with the exception perhaps of Councillor Tedder, who was here in the last council, and I was chair of this committee in the last council as an opposition member. The portfolio holder may have come once, right at the end of the council, to this committee. It was a great disadvantage not to have them there in the room, Because if you're dealing with financial issues, and heavens to Betsy we were, because we'd never had an audit, you know, everything was up in the air, and the financial portfolio holder wasn't here. So any questions? It was like trying to do things in the wind that, you know, you had no control over. I'll say no more than that. But it was really important that they were there. And I believe because we are not the auditors of the financial situation, that is your job. We receive your audit, but we don't do it. If we did it, then I would agree the portfolio holder would not be appropriate. But as we don't, I think it's vital that they're there. That's my opinion. Councillor Wilson.
Yeah, I'd like to add my thanks for the report. It's got so much in it that's really relevant. On that subject, before we go on to other ones, it does note in the report that the governance working group reviewed the terms of reference of this committee in 2023. I'm a backbench councillor. I chair the governance working group, and we reported to full council in December 2023, and the full report is available in the full council's public agenda pack. And we did not recommend to bring an independent representative, co-opt one, onto this committee. We did consider it. We considered it at length, and the governance working group it's completely cross-party. There are 7 members, 4 from the Liberal Democrats and the other 3 group leaders. And I don't think anybody, after the discussion, and we took officer advice obviously as well, thought on balance in practice that we could have an independent representative and it would add to it. We did decide and recommend to full council, and all of this was passed unanimously at full council, not to have an independent representative, but to allow public questions for up to 30 minutes at the start of this committee. And we have had a few, not tonight, but we have had a few from people who have read everything clearly as well. Well, one person in particular had read everything and added a lot with his questions. And the other point is we also have a scrutiny committee. We've got 2 scrutiny committees, and the executive are not permitted to be members of them. They're not even permitted to attend unless invited by the chair. And one of them is Performance and Finance Scrutiny Committee, which met last week. And the intention of these committees is to scrutinise and challenge the executive by backbenchers. So we have quite a lot of these functions already in the Constitution. Thank you.
Councillor Cope.
Thank you. Just sort of wanting to input here as sort of one of the non-administration councillors. I guess, and I think this is something that my colleague, Councillor Malvaganam, has raised multiple times before, there is a slight pretense of marking your own homework here, I would say, and it's not criticism of individuals, but if the finance portfolio holder is here, and most of the things that we talk about are going to be related inevitably to council finance, there's going to be a perception that there is an element of marking your own homework. We've had the leader of the council subbing here again before, and obviously I guess you guys all get together and talk about this beforehand anyway. You've released a press release 10 minutes before this meeting, which presumably the finance portfolio holder has fed into. So I guess my view is this...
I haven't met with Councillor McIntyre for some weeks, so I'd like that comment withdrawn.
Okay, fine, that was my presumption. I thought that may be the case. But anyway, I guess the point is this should be an opportunity for councillors to bring a fresh perspective, and I think that's difficult to do if you've already been involved in the decision making. So my sort of feeling on this, and I'm conscious that we've got a committee of 7, 5 of our people who are going to be minded to back the administration, might not do so every time, but it might be good to get some fresh voices.
Yeah, I take your point. I was an opposition chair. I shouldn't be chairing this committee. At the outset of this council, the post of this chair was offered to the opposition. Nobody wanted it. It was offered again. Nobody wanted. I'm still here. Take it away, please.
So I think the issue is, and no surprise that we discuss these things amongst our group about what is most effective. My concern is that if we have a committee of 7 people, only 2 of whom are not Liberal Democrats, 1 of whom has to deal with chairing, and therefore, your mind is slightly on the role of chairing and not so much on the role of being inquisitive and questioning, that may also diminish our ability to probe things effectively. But it's certainly something worth considering.
Proportionality?
No, I completely understand the point that we should get better at winning elections. I'm just making an observation about how this committee can perform its role effectively, and I'm in 2 minds about whether that's best to have someone chairing it who is outside of the Liberal Democrat group, or if we're better having 2 people here who can really focus on asking the questions.
And of course, prior to that, when it was all Conservatives, then it was, these things change. And I think, my position has not changed. Councillor McIntyre.
Can we go back to my original question, which this has been brilliant. But my question was, are we overseeing executive function topics, or is it outside of the bandwidth, in which case the rest then of the conversation is relevant? So I don't know, yeah.
Please.
Thank you. I think that my view is there's sufficient separation between the work of this committee to the executive, because, as Councillor McIntyre mentioned earlier, the reports don't go through the executive before they come here, so they're dealt with here. There is an element of separation because of that. The recommendation to not have a member of the executive on this committee is best practice, but it isn't a statutory requirement, so there is some flexibility for the council to make its own decision on that based on the best people with the experience, knowledge and expertise to contribute effectively.
Yes, expertise is a really good point. Councillor Cope, you said you're not a financial person. I've said it often enough. Rob's not. Richard isn't. Leanne definitely is. So, Rob.
Thank you, Chair. This kind of reminds me a little bit of local government reform if we go to Surrey County Council in 1993, when the incoming Conservative leader made himself the chair of the Audit Committee, which I'm guessing is probably not the best of things to do. And I think I agree there. I think looking randomly, I've picked on 2 random borough councils to see who chairs their audit. So I've gone to Bromsgrove, so Midlands area, it's Labour controlled, and the chair of that committee is a Labour Party member. I've gone to Kingston upon Thames, a Royal Borough, and the chair of the audit committee there is Liberal Democrat. It's a Liberal Democrat administration. And I'm sure if I go around the country, there will be a commonality. I think it's fair to say I'm no shrinking violet, and I will hold this administration to account. And I think on a number of occasions, I think, Chair, you'll probably agree with me, I've pushed the boundaries of holding the administration to account and made it uncomfortable for some of the people within the Liberal Democrat group. So I think it's about the ability of the individuals to hold the authority to account. This meeting is recorded in public. So if there are a lack of holding people to account, it's there for all to see. I don't see under this administration a lack of probing questions. There may have been in the past, but that's in the past. So I think the one question I would raise, and this is to show that, I do hold this committee separate to my political grouping. I've not sat on an audit committee or chaired an audit committee before where the finance member sits on the committee. Now, I think that may be something to explore, as a consideration. I've chaired an audit committee for a number of years in another local authority where I was the administration and I was the chair of the audit committee, and we were able to act independently with integrity. I don't remember us having an independent person on those either, and I'm sure looking through there are a number of examples of that. So I think that's the only one that I would call out as something to explore myself. The difficulty we face is Leanne gets finance, and as you've seen, if you look back at previous meetings, sure you have, we're heavily relying on a limited number of people who actually understand those complexities. It can be a challenging time, and as I spoke about being scared when I was first elected of not having sufficient paperwork I as a member could understand.
Thank you. Councillor Cope.
It's sort of pretty similar to what Councillor Lee asked, but I just wanted to ask Grant Thornton, are we unusual that we don't follow this best practice guidance? Or is this something that you're recommending to councils quite often and seeing a lot?
So I'll give you my view, and then I'm sure Andy will come in. So I can think of other councils where we have reported similar concerns against SIPFA guidance and against best practice. And those councils are of different political persuasions. What we're highlighting here is the principle that this committee, an audit committee or an audit and risk committee, should be apolitical. It should be focused on testing, seeking assurance for the systems of internal control, risk management. SIPFA's best practice is that a cabinet holder for finance, it's discouraged, it's not prohibited, it's discouraged. But if a portfolio holder for finance does sit on an audit committee, that there are mitigating arrangements put in place, such as an independent representative or 2 independent representatives. SIPFA goes as far as suggesting that an audit committee ought to have 2 independent members anyway, again to help maintain, or one for a skills input and technical input, which may well address the financial skill gap. Your expertise excluded from that, but also to help maintain that apolitical focus. We've highlighted here and we've set out, I think, quite clearly our view. We've seen, we've assessed the arrangements you have. We've highlighted that against the best practice, the expected practice. We think, certainly for 2 audit committees that we attended, there was the potential for it to be political. So we're highlighting that risk. And it's for this committee to decide, given its circumstances, whether or not this recommendation is adopted. We do, as you said, Councillor Wilson, we note that the involvement of an independent representative was considered by your governance working group. It wasn't clear from the papers and from the minutes whether that consideration was framed, and the decision that was reached was also framed against SIPFA's current guidance on audit committees that was released in 2022. The minutes are just not clear enough for me to be able to determine that.
I could answer that. It wasn't particularly, but it was a recommendation that came to us from the leadership as well. So,
Councillor McIntyre. Then Councillor Lee.
Thank you. Just so that we don't spend a disproportionate amount of time on one recommendation, as exciting as it is. So I suppose my final thoughts on it are, I'd love to have an evening back. So I've got, from a personal point of view, more than happy to move off, or just not be the finance portfolio holder and still come and enjoy the highlights of this meeting. On a serious note, I mean, we're not going to resolve it today. I do think it's an important thing to resolve because we talk a lot about transparency and doing things in the right way. And if overall the feeling is that that's not the right way, then we should address that. Can we agree an action that the governance working group go away again and have a look at the makeup, or whether it's, I don't know whether that's the right forum to do it in, but goes away, compares against it for best practice and any other guidelines and comes back with a recommendation. I suppose what I really want to make sure that we don't do, and this goes back to the conversation we had at PNF about having a skills audit, is that residents of a borough or any jurisdiction shouldn't feel like they cannot stand to be a councillor because they don't have the right skill set. And by talking about skill sets and what the whole makeup looks like, I mean, we have 36 councillors overall, 35. I'm good at numbers. You're not going to pick. We don't have loads of people. We're not going to be able to pick a certain person to do that and a certain person to do something else. So we have a small number of people that want to represent the residents and their views and their thoughts. And for me, we need to just make the best of the selection of people we have. And that will change. So, and I know your point, Andy, was about, it's not about the person, it's about the roles. I think with a small group of people, you're always going to have an element of conflict. And maybe we do need independent people. Maybe we need to make a rule about the portfolio holder not being on certain committees or whatever. But as I say, I don't think we're not going to solve that tonight. And in the interest of us all getting home to our families, how about we have an action to come back with a recommendation?
Councillor Wilson, mentioned in dispatches there.
Thank you. Yeah, I picked that up. The governance working group are currently working on changes to the constitution affecting this committee, so that is in hand. But Councillor McIntyre is far too modest. We absolutely need her expertise on this committee. If you look at, turning to the other two key recommendations that feed in, improvement recommendation 9 is about the strategic risk register versus risk appetite. We didn't have any record of the council's risk appetite until about a year ago when Councillor McIntyre suggested at this committee that officers work on that, and now we have a risk register versus risk appetite, and that wouldn't have happened if we hadn't had the expertise on this committee. And we've seen from the other two key recommendations how key it is to have proper transparency and clarity about the council's finances, which we did not have, and that has to be our top priority rather than this recommendation, I think, because this is about budget monitoring, and we only get that far if we've already dealt with financial sustainability and budget setting, where we have significant weaknesses at the moment.
Thank you, Councillor Wilson. Councillor Lee, I apologise.
That's all right, Chair. I know my place. There's no favouritism in the Lib Dems. I think you've just shot down what I was going to say to a certain degree. I think the importance of what you're suggesting needs to be properly considered. I would go so far as to say it needs to be acted upon. As you can tell, I'm of a different opinion to Councillor Wilson, so I'm not sure I recognise the need to be political. I think not having exec members actually sit on this committee, I do agree with, which again leaves me at odds with a number of members in my party, so I'm happy to not be political, which I think is a really important message to land here. I've never seen this committee as political. I've seen it as extremely probing. I think some people may find that probing and questioning uncomfortable, particularly if we're trying to get to the bottom of things, and that's actually quite important. That's presumably what you'd expect us to do, is to ask the tough questions. I think you'd probably feel a bit sorry for some of us who don't have enough of the technical knowledge. So when we've perhaps asked questions, we've been bamboozled with the answers, whether that's by accident or by design. I wouldn't like to comment. Could get me into trouble, shall we say. But it certainly happens. So perhaps understanding what an external resource could look like to support members could be a good idea. Perhaps there's personalities that could make things harder under certain circumstances. I don't want you to stray into difficult territory tonight, but perhaps that external person could help with a better understanding, because obviously reaching out for technical resources for some of the things in these meetings means lengthy phone calls with subject matter experts who are doing it out of the goodness of their heart, which is probably not how we should be running a multi-million-pound local authority. So I think if the governance working group are to look at it, I'd like to see some form of input, Chair, if you'll indulge me, from someone such as Grant Thornton giving some advice in as well, to make sure that we are leading independently in the right direction. Again, my party line doesn't exist, so I'm saying what I think from my own experience chairing an audit committee. I think we can risk throwing the baby out with the bathwater in an extremity because of a unique set of circumstances. But I think at a high level, not having exec members sit directly on here would probably be the right thing. Having councillors supported so they're not bamboozled by technical jargon, some of which is then proven to be factually wrong, which is quite scary, as you can imagine. If someone's giving you information, you take it in because they're the subject matter expert, and then you go and check it and find it's wrong. It makes you feel kind of a bit silly. So hopefully that sort of sets a bit of a framework around it without getting myself into any trouble.
Thank you. Yeah, I do truly believe that in order to ask the right questions, you have to have a pretty sound knowledge of the subject to do them. I don't. You know, I understand about auditing. Finance, I employ accountants, and there's a reason I spend money on accountants, because they know more about it than I do. Same with audits. Anybody else got any comments to make? Councillor Cope.
Thanks, Chair. I'm just sort of moving up beyond that particular point. The report, sort of talks about underlying cost pressures, etc. I don't know why it keeps doing that. Underlying cost pressures and things we should be resolving, and it says prior to the setting of the 25-26 budget and MTFS. Now, obviously, we're going to vote on that in 2 weeks, so presumably there's not a lot of time. So I guess might be more a question for Vicky. How many of these sort of recommendations have already been fed in? And how much sight did you have of this before you started preparing the numbers for the budget that we're voting on in a couple of weeks?
Since we've been going through the audit and having just ongoing dialogue, we've been trying to review those actions. I can't say for certain that we've implemented all of them, and it's certainly something that we will be picking up in the next few weeks before the next audit anyway. So it's been a factor. It's been so I can't say for sure that we've actually gone through and specifically ticked off against what we've written in the budget, but it's certainly been a factor. We've probably had the first draft of this a couple of weeks ago, an early draft, so we could sort of comment and have some more dialogue on it. But we were generally aware of some. So nothing in here was unexpected based on the conversations we'd had during the whole of the audit process.
Thank you. Yeah, it's common practice, as you say, when you're doing an audit, you have an exit meeting, and sometimes you get things fixed at that. And hopefully that's the standard practice. Councillor Wilson.
Yeah, I wanted to turn to the other recommendations, key recommendations as well. And it says in the report that they are kind of linked, the recommendation, the weakness about short to medium term financial planning because of the financial state of the council, and budget setting because of the historical inaccuracies that we've had. So it seems like the historical inaccuracies have led to a lot of the problems that we have now with the debt and the unsustainable nature of the reduction of the reserves, which is mentioned in the report. And it says a key consideration of that was the lack of capacity in the finance team. Doesn't apply now, but it did in the past. So that seems to be the key factor that has caused the lack of capacity. And then if we didn't have the lack of capacity, we wouldn't be in the situation we are now, because we heard evidence like last week's Performance and Finance Scrutiny Committee that, quote, different decisions would have been made if we had had accurate information this time last year for the budget. So, and it says in the annual governance statement with the new disclaimed accounts that a key failure of governance has been corrected by stabilising the finance team. So I guess my question is, during your auditing and observation of the council, at what point was it noticed that this was a key weakness and a key threat to the existence of the council, basically not having a stable finance team, so not having accurate financial information, which leads to potentially is key consideration in the state of the council's finances now and them being currently unsustainable?
So I think it was at the time of the production of the Q2 outturn report, and I think that unveiled the challenge. So I'm not saying we identified it, I think we've just linked.
Sorry, that wasn't really what I was meaning to ask. Yeah, that was the time when the missing interest, debt interest and things like that became obvious. But when did it become obvious that, and it only became obvious because the finance team had been stabilised. So, and that was done in 2023, recruitment started second half of 2023 and it was finished in about April 2024. So that happened because it was obvious there was a failure in accuracy of financial information. So when was that made obvious? Was it just with the new administration, or was it further back that was made?
I don't know the answer to that.
It seems to be the key factor that everything else flows from. No.
So I'll just add, obviously our review is of arrangements in 23-24. So we don't make commentary on the arrangements that were in place prior to that with our predecessor auditors in place. I don't think in the time that we've been doing our review, I don't think there's ever been unclear that the issues with capacity in the finance team were an issue. So I mean, because in discussions about setting the budget, as we say in the report, it was clear that a top-down process was used, and that was because of issues with capacity. So I don't think it's never been unapparent to us that it was a key factor. But when it would have become apparent prior to us being in situ, it's not possible to say.
Okay, and if it was still apparent and it was known about, then it would have been in the annual governance statement for the previous year as an area for improvement. But it's not. Sorry, do you agree with that?
As I say, our review starts 23-24. I think it's we took the position that we're starting from that position. We're starting from 23-24, and the council is where it is. So we're looking at the arrangements as they are in place in 23-24.
And can you assure us that everything now is okay? Is that possible?
I'll take that question. No, we can't.
Yeah. No.
I just wasn't going to give a broad assurance to that effect. We haven't specifically considered the finance team's capacity. We've noted that the Section 151 officer working with members and other senior officers felt that the finance team needed to be enhanced as part of the finance stabilisation plan. That's been enacted. We can see that when the key staff have been recruited, the budget has been worked through in greater detail. Some of the issues have been unearthed, which we comment on in the report. The only other link I would make, if you go back to the other agenda item, and we said about the question of the finance team's ability to source evidence, respond to audit queries in a timely manner, you could say at its heart there's a question there about capacity. But I think it's too early for us to say, just with this 1 year's work, whether that is indeed an underlying, ongoing issue. But it's something we can have regard to as part of our work for next year.
So I can take that as a qualified, you're in the right direction.
Or you could take it as a disclaimer of opinion.
Thank you. Councillor Lee.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, what I was trying to do was just tie together, because Vicky, you said obviously at times with the audit ongoing, the team was pressured. And I think it's just understanding from this committee where the engine room's at and how hot it's running. And I think it's good to see from both sides and have that positive watching brief. I think there's a debate as to when the administration was alerted to that capacity problem and how. I think there's probably a viewpoint that the administration asked, have you got a capacity problem? And had to tease out that there was a capacity problem to be able to deliver that capacity growth, which I think is a little unusual. But, you know, it was done, and obviously that led to the growth in capacity, which is great. But it's also understanding how the team are working in the engine room, because, of course, we've got a peak of work that's going to be difficult to make up for those years of no audits and financial statements that you can't give assurance to. So that there's a bit of a challenge there. So it's just understanding from that human dynamic those pressures there and making sure that we're aware as a committee as to where that's landing, because that's really important to recover the situation.
So I don't think we reference back as to who initiated, whether there was a need for an enhanced capacity. I don't think we've looked at that. I think we've just acknowledged the review was undertaken, it's enacted, and that was a positive, and then what flowed from that. The reason I didn't want to be drawn on giving you a judgment as to the sufficiency of the finance team's capacity currently is because, as we said in the previous report, this has been an unusual year given the volume of financial statements the finance team has prepared and supported, dealing with new auditors for 23-24 and the increased quantity of queries, and the work it's undertaken to work through the budget on a line-by-line basis that's unearthed some of the challenges you're now facing. I think it needs to be a more normalised year before we can even begin to say whether there is an issue. So we're just reserving our judgment, I guess.
Just to just sort of enhance what Darren said, is that a very unusual year because the audit didn't start till October. Bang smack when we start our budgets. So new finance team, you know, budgeting process, budget monitoring process, and audit. So it was the perfect storm. So we've obviously been in dialogue about when they may start the audit for 24-25. So hopefully it will start being more normal because the time frames will fit normal, you know, into the normal kind of annual calendar as opposed to everything all be at once. So that will also help with capacity.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for all you and the wider finance team, both up and down and left and right, are all doing. Thank you very, very much.
Yes, I echo that. And traditionally, at almost every meeting of this committee, I've asked Alex, have you got enough staff? He's always come back and said, yes, we're okay. I think in the future, have you got enough staff? Will be a question I will ask if I'm here. Pardon? That's a different question. Yeah. Totally different question. Members, any more?
Thanks. It's,
is this near the end?
yeah, actually it's the first page. It's page 5 of the report, page 83 of the full agenda pack. It's the executive summary because it's important. It's basically the first part of it. It says, in late 2016, the council purchased the Square shopping centre for 94 million and the House of Fraser store for 19 million. We have changed the constitution in the meantime. The House of Fraser store was bought incorrectly using the urgent action process, so it was only signed off by 3 people. It now requires the monitoring officer to sign off anything like that, which would be a key decision because it's over £100,000. So that's 113 million pounds for these 2 assets that were bought there, and it's at the start of the executive summary because it's so important 9 years later nearly. What are these assets worth now? Do you know? Does anybody know?
The combined between the two is around 20 million. The exact figure I'd have to check, but it's around that figure. I can confirm the exact figure for the minutes.
That's okay. So that's a loss of about over 90 million pounds. So the majority of the council's debt went on these, and they're almost worthless. And that's not a question.
Well, thank you for that. We all go away smiling now. Anybody else? No? Thank you, gentlemen, for coming and for being so helpful and for presenting us with something to talk about. We've never had this before. And you see how much we are happy about that. Thank you, Vicky, for your answers and everything, and everybody for attending. I declare the meeting closed.